Evolution, Chapter 6, Double Trouble. Jen was running late for Julie's tennis match. Her best friend was going to kill her. She had to take a detour to stop the Forever Knights from breaking into a museum across from the stadium. Apparently, with the reveal of Jen's identity, the Knights had lost all trace of subtlety they ever had. They were rolling up on the museum in a literal tank in broad daylight. Jen was worried about what they were after, but had no time to spare. Her attempt to slip quietly into the stadium did not go well. She had to practically fight her way to her seat between Gwen and Kevin. People tried to shove pens and markers into her hands to get an autograph. She managed to get to her seat only because of Gwen's infamous glare that warned off the crowd. She hunkered down and grinned sheepishly at Julie. Julie rolled her eyes, but waved back. Jen had apparently made it in time to see the final serve. Julie won the match, and as the other people made their way to the food court, Jen vaulted over the divider and down to Julie. "I am so sorry I was late." The words left her mouth before Julie could speak. "The Forever Knights attacked the museum, and Julie raised a hand to forestall the explanation. "I get it. At least you're here now. I appreciate it, Jen." Jen nodded, and Julie made her way into the locker rooms. Jen leaned in the doorway as Kevin and Gwen joined her. Gwen frowned as Jen pulled her phone out of her pocket. "What are you doing?"
$20 says she's looking up the times for that new Sumo Slammers movie.
Kevin joked. Jen shot him a dirty look. "Joke's on you. I was at the midnight premiere." She quipped, "I'm texting Pierce. If the Knights are after something in the museum, they'll try again." Kevin frowned.
"You want to ditch the game? Go see if we can catch him in the act?"
he asked, and Gwen frowned at both of them. "No, you promised to be here for Julie." Jen sighed. She really did need to find out what the Knights were after. Ever since she and Kai Green had discovered a mysterious set of books in a castle buried in Nevada, the Knights had been upping their game. Kevin shrugged.
"Too bad you can't be in two places. I'm gonna grab a corn dog."
Jen frowned slightly as he walked away. "I'm gonna run to the restroom before the next set," she told Gwen and slipped into the room. Delighted to see an actual lock on the door, she slid it into place and transformed into Echo Echo. She split into two. They nodded at each other. "Okay, we set our Ultimatrixes for human." They both did so, and in a flash of green, there were two Jennifer Tennysons standing there. The first smiled at the second. "Ooh, it actually worked!" The second scoffed. "Of course it did." The first nodded. "I'll stay here and keep our promise to Julie. You can go with Kevin and Pierce to investigate the Forever Knights." The second Jen shrugged. "Whatever, as long as I get to hit something." The first Jen slipped out of the bathroom and rejoined Gwen, making their way to their seats. The second ambled out of the restroom and over to Kevin, who was munching on a corn dog. "Want to go bust some Forever Knights?" Kevin frowned, looking down at Jen.
"Didn't I just see you with Gwen?"
Jen shrugged. "Whatever, I'll go alone if you don't want to come." She turned and walked away. Kevin frowned deeper, but followed her. Pierce met them at the museum, but he was alone. Jen frowned as he carefully slipped into the car, careful not to tear the upholstery with his spikes. He'd forgone his ID mask today. Despite Jen's best efforts, his face had popped up in a few times in the press, too. "What happened to you bringing people with you?" Jen sounded annoyed. Pierce frowned.
"Everyone else was busy. There are negotiations happening with..."
Jen cut him off with a roll of her eyes. "Whatever. They wouldn't be much use anyway." Pierce and Kevin both frowned, shooting each other a confused look. Jen might not enjoy the more bureaucratic plumbers, but she'd never called any of the ones currently at the base useless like this before.
"You doing okay, Jen?"
Pierce asked. She shot him a look, and he raised his eyebrows. "Do I look like I want to talk about my feelings right now?" Pierce settled back into his seat. Kevin frowned.
"Thought I was supposed to be the resident asshole,"
he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jen's steely look turned to him. "No, you're the resident criminal who's boning my cousin, or at least working up the courage to get that far." Kevin blinked.
"I'm sorry, what?"
Jen glanced down at her fingernails. "You heard me. You don't have the courage to take the next step with my cousin. She intimidates you. Is it the power or the attitude? My guess would be both." Pierce and Kevin stared at Jen. Less than a block away, things were going swimmingly. Jen clapped politely as Julie scored another point. Gwen smiled at her cousin. Good to see you enjoying the game. I'm glad you decided to keep your promise to Julie. I know the nights are important to you, but you do need a life outside of your hero work. Jen nodded. You're absolutely right. Though sometimes I worry neither of us have the social life we should. Gwen frowned. How do you mean? She whispered as Julie's opponent served the ball again. Well, with all the work we do, neither of us really has the time to pursue other things. I may not be emotionally ready to step back out into the dating scene, but you and Kevin seem to be doing well. But I'm worried that all you have is work, and I don't want that to be the case. It's why I've been trying to distance myself from you two. So you have some time alone away from the bombardment of the press to deal with. Gwen stared at her cousin as Julie scored again. What? The redhead shook her head at the brunette, trying to process everything that had just been dumped in her lap. Jen nodded, more focused on the match than on Gwen. I know I've been distant since the accident. The tears building in Jen's eyes told Gwen which accident she was talking about, the one that had killed Ethan. But you're my family. I value your opinion and happiness. If there's anything I can do to help, I will. All you have to do is ask. Gwen stared at her cousin. Are you feeling all right? I feel fine. Why? Gwen shook her head. You hate opening up like this, especially in public places. Gwen looked around. The people directly behind them tried to look like they weren't listening into their conversation. Gwen frowned. Jen frowned. Sometimes it's hard to deal with everything I'm responsible for. I have the weight of worlds on my shoulders. It's not easy, but it shouldn't be about me. Gwen nodded, pulling out her phone. She hit Kevin's speed dial.
Hey, Gwen, can I call you back?
No, Jen's acting really weird. Gwen hissed into her phone. There was a pause.
What are you talking about? Jen's here with me.
Gwen glanced at the Jen sitting next to her. We may have a problem then, because she's also sitting here with me. Silence reigned on the other side of the phone, followed by a large explosion, one that echoed even to the stadium as murmurs broke out in the crowd. Jen's phone rang as the referee called a timeout. So sorry, I need to take this. Chapter 7, Meeting of the Minds. If Kevin hadn't been running for his life, he would have questioned why there were two Jens standing outside the museum, where there had only been one that ran out ahead of him. Soon, Upchuck and Big Chill were both fighting the Forever Knight, Yurik, in his alien armor, but they seemed less coordinated than Jen usually was. They frowned at each other. I think it's time, one said, for a meeting of the minds. The other finished, and both switched their Ultimatrixes to Echo Echo before melding back into one, and green lights flashed. Jen blinked as though slightly confused about why she was where she was. She just had enough time to dodge a large metal fist. The Forever Knight laughed. I see you've chosen to go back to your singular self. But has no one told you there's safety in numbers? She shrugged. You would think so, yeah. Not always true, though. She flicked the dial on the Ultimatrix and slapped it down. Green lights flashed and stayed as her anodite form materialized around her. She giggled as she took off into the air and spun around the armor, leaving a trail of green energy behind her. He tripped over it as Jen's green energy hair grew and spread, ripping chunks out of the armor. He tried to fire off a laser, but Jen raised blackish green hands. Contigo, she shouted, and a green shield blossomed. Her mana hair ripped into the armor, leaving the knight free. He took off. Jen pointed at him with one hand, dropping the shield. Appendage of Regoria. The knight froze, floating a few inches above the ground. Jen grinned a glowing smile. Go ahead and cuff him, Pierce. Careful, though. The spell breaks when you touch him. Pierce nodded and knocked the immobilized knight out of the air and cuffed him quickly as Kevin called for the plumbers to pick up the offender. Pierce glanced at this transformation and grinned. What do you call him this one? Jen thought for a moment, floating a few feet above the ground. Stardust. She grinned and spun in the air. Kevin grinned slightly, then shook his head.
At least you seem to be studying that book Gwen gave you.
Jen nodded and pulled that same book out of thin air. It's gotten to the point where I can summon it in this transformation whenever. She landed, and green lights flashed again as the plumbers arrived and loaded up the Forever Knight and the trashed armor. Pierce left with them, and Kevin grabbed the back of Jen's shirt and dragged her into his car. He pointed a finger at Jen very close to her nose.
Your cousin and I are very happy, and for your information, I am respecting her, so you can take your opinion about when we need to bone and stuff 'em.
He turned to the steering wheel. Jen buckled her seatbelt and buried her head in her hands. Fuck, I may have said too much when I was two people. Kevin nodded.
Yeah, but you get to explain when Gwen's here to yell at you, too.
Jen nodded and kept quiet as they returned to the stadium. During their fight, the final set had ended and Julie had been declared the victor. Gwen had stuck around to watch the game, and both girls glared at Jen as she and Kevin made their way to the bottom of the stands. Julie raised an eyebrow, and Jen launched into her explanation. She'd had no idea that splitting herself as Echo would cause a personality split, too. Gwen nodded. That explains the easy emotional unloading you dropped on me. Jen buried her head in her hands. Gwen patted her on the back. It's not a bad thing. More a lot to process. Jen groaned. It's like splitting myself completely tossed any filters out the window. Kevin laughed.
That's true.
Gwen glanced at him questioningly.
She essentially called the plumbers a coward to Pierce's face and made some other suggestions.
He coughed. Gwen looked between the two. Jen glared at Kevin. I said Kevin was too much of a coward to take your relationship to the next level. I think the wording I used was that you two need to bone. Both of them went bright red. Julie burst out laughing. That in and of itself might be enough for me to forgive you for missing my match. Come on, you owe me dinner. Jen nodded and scampered away from her embarrassed teammates as quickly as she could, dragging Julie along behind her. Gwen coughed slightly as Kevin avoided meeting her eyes. Neither of them spoke as they made their way out of the stadium.